The auctioneer's voice, coarse as sand and twice as grating, slices through the dusty air of the livery yard. All right, folks, let's keep it moving. Next up, we got a matched pair, sisters they are. Fresh off the stage, orphaned and looking for placement. He gestures with a stained hand towards two young women huddled on a low platform. One sister, Clara, with hair like spun gold and eyes the blue of a summer sky, draws appreciative murmurs. The other, Ilara, stands slightly behind, her plain brown hair pulled back severely, her face pale and unremarkable, her gaze fixed on the splintered wood beneath her worn boots. She is 19, like her sister, but where Clara seems to bloom under the scrutiny, Ilara visibly wilts. The auctioneer, a man named Jebediah Sneed, clearly knows which one will draw the bids. Let's start with the pretty one, shall we? Clara, step forward, dear. Clara does, a practiced, if timid, smile gracing her lips. The bidding for her is brisk, men calling out for a housekeeper, a scullery maid, some with less savory intentions hinted in their leers. She's sold quickly to a portly merchant, Mr. Croft, for a sum that makes Sneed grin. Then he turns to Ilara. And now for the, other one, Ilara. Good worker, I'm told. Strong, if a bit. Plain. What am I bid for this sturdy lass? Good for scrubbing, laundry, mucking out. Who'll start me at $5? Silence. A few snickers ripple through the crowd. Ilara flinches as if struck. Her gaze, when it flickers up, is filled with a quiet desperation that clutches at something deep inside Elias Thorne. He stands at the edge of the small crowd, his weathered hat pulled low, his duster coated with the trail's grit. He hadn't come for this. He'd come for salt licks and a new axe handle. But the sight of the girl, so obviously dismissed, so utterly alone, resonates with a loneliness he knows too well. Sneed tries again. $3. A strong back for $3, gentlemen. Can't beat that. More silence, broken only by a gust of wind whistling through the livery. Ilara's shoulders slump further. Elias sees the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes before she drops her head again, her hands clenching at her sides. He sees not ugliness, but a profound, crushing humiliation. That was a close call. Before we see how our hero navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The auctioneer is about to dismiss her, to perhaps consign her to some even worse fate, when Elias's voice, rough from disuse, cuts through the quiet. $1. Sneed's head snaps towards him, surprised. The crowd murmurs. $1 was an insult, but it was also a bid. $1 for this specimen. Sneed sneers, but his eyes gleam with the chance to offload her. Do I hear too? Silence again. Ilara slowly lifts her head, her gaze finding Elias. There's no hope in it, just a dazed confusion. Sold. Sneed bangs a makeshift gavel on a barrel. To the quiet fella at the back for $1. She's all yours, friend, and good luck to ya. And with those words, Elias Thorne, a man who kept to himself on a struggling ranch miles from town, a man who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to anyone in weeks, found his life, and hers, irrevocably changed. The ride to his ranch was a long, silent affair. Elias had collected his meager supplies, paid Sneed the $1. The man had the gall to look smug, and then simply gestured for Ilara to follow him to where his old gelding Buck was tied. She moved like a sleepwalker, her face pale and shuddered. He'd offered her a hand up to sit behind him on Buck, but she'd merely shaken her head, her eyes downcast, and indicated she would walk. He hadn't pressed it. The trail was rough, winding up into the foothills, the air growing cooler as they climbed. His ranch wasn't much, just a small weathered cabin, a leaning barn, and several acres of stubborn, rocky land that he fought to make productive. It was a solitary existence, one he'd chosen after. Elara trailed a few paces behind the horse, her steps even but heavy, as if each one was a burden. He glanced back occasionally. She never looked up, just kept her focus on the dusty ground. He wondered what she was thinking, what horrors she imagined. He wasn't a cruel man, but he knew his reputation in the town of Redemption Gulch was that of a recluse, perhaps a little touched by sorrow or hardship. He wasn't what any young woman, even one sold at auction, would hope for. When they finally reached the small clearing where his cabin stood, smoke curling thinly from the stone chimney, he dismounted. "This is it," he said, his voice still gravelly. Elara stopped, her gaze sweeping over the humble dwelling, the untamed wilderness pressing in on all sides. He couldn't read her expression. It was as if she'd retreated deep inside herself. The townsfolk of Redemption Gulch had watched him lead her away. He'd felt their stares, heard the muttered comments. Thorns finally lost it. What's he want with her? Waste of $1, even if it was just one. He'd ignored them, his face set. The prejudice, the casual cruelty, was a familiar beast. He'd seen it plenty. He understood the societal judgment that had priced Clara high and Elara at nearly nothing. Beauty, or the lack of it, was a currency he'd never had much use for. His late wife, Martha, hadn't been a conventional beauty either, but her spirit had been as bright and warm as a summer sunrise. The thought of Martha brought a familiar ache. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs its main furniture. A narrow cot was in one corner, his own wider bed in another. A few shelves held tin plates and cups, a small sack of flour, coffee, beans. "You can take that one," he said, gesturing to the cot. "I'll fetch some water." He didn't wait for a reply, just took the bucket and headed for the creek that ran behind the cabin. He needed a moment. What had he done? He'd acted on impulse, on a surge of something that felt dangerously like compassion, a sentiment he'd tried to bury for years. He was a rancher, not a rescuer. His life was hard enough. When he returned, Elara was still standing in the same spot, her small bundle of belongings at her feet. He filled the kettle, hung it over the fire. "Supper will be beans and bacon," he stated, not looking at her. "There's a privy out back, creek water for washing." He tried to sound matter-of-fact, to establish a routine, however strange. She finally moved, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." Just 2 words, whispered to the floorboards. He grunted in acknowledgement, busying himself with the food. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken fears and uncertainties. He knew she was afraid. He was, in his own way, just as uncertain. He'd bought her to save her from something worse. Now he had to figure out what to do with the life he'd so impulsively claimed. The next morning, Elias rose before dawn, as was his habit. He moved quietly, stoking the fire, making coffee. He expected Elara to still be asleep, exhausted from her ordeal. But when he turned from the hearth, she was awake, sitting on the edge of her cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes, though shadowed with weariness, were clear and watchful. She looked like a startled deer, poised for flight. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice low. "Coffee's on." She nodded, but didn't move. He poured himself a cup, then, after a moment's hesitation, poured another and set it on the table near her. He went outside to tend to Buck and his few chickens, giving her space. When he came back in, the coffee was untouched, but she had made an attempt to tidy her meager belongings. He noticed she'd smoothed the thin blanket on her cot with a careful hand. He started to prepare a simple breakfast of skillet bread and leftover bacon. "There's chores, if you're able," he said, not unkindly. "Chopping wood, mending fence, tending the garden, whatever you can manage." He wasn't expecting her to be a seasoned farmhand. He was offering her a way to earn her keep, to feel useful, perhaps. She finally spoke, her voice a little stronger than the night before. "I can work. I'm not afraid of it." There was a quiet dignity in her tone that surprised him. "I can cook some, and mend. My mother taught us." He nodded. "All right then. After breakfast, we'll see about the woodpile." The first test of their strange arrangement came a few days later, when Elias needed to go into Redemption Gulch for supplies he couldn't do without: flour, salt, some nails. He hesitated to take Elara, knowing the stares and whispers they would face. But leaving her alone for a full day at the isolated cabin didn't sit right with him either. "I'm heading to town," he announced. "You can come or stay, your choice." She looked at him, a flicker of something, fear, apprehension, in her eyes. Then, quietly, "I'll come." The town lived up to his grim expectations. As they walked Buck down the dusty main street towards the mercantile, conversations ceased, heads turned. He saw the women purse their lips, saw the men nudge each other and smirk. Elara kept her eyes down, her shoulders hunched, but he noticed her hands were steady. At Henderson's mercantile, Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose disapproval could curdle milk, gave Elara a long, assessing look that was more insult than inquiry. "Thorne," she said, her voice sharp. "Didn't expect to see you with company." Elias met her gaze coolly. "Need flour, Mrs. Henderson?" "And salt." He refused to acknowledge her unspoken question, her blatant judgment. As he paid, a group of local idlers by the door made a few loud comments. "Thorne's got himself a bargain, eh?" one guffawed. "Wonder if she was worth the whole $1." Elara flinched, a dull flush rising on her neck. Before Elias could speak, a low growl rumbled from his chest. He didn't raise his voice, but his eyes, when he turned them on the men, were like chips of ice. "Mind your manners," he said, the words clipped, "or I'll help you find them." The men, surprised by his quiet intensity, shuffled their feet and fell silent. He didn't look at Elara, just collected his goods and gestured for her to precede him out the door. He had defended her, in his own terse way. He felt her slight, almost imperceptible glance towards him as they walked away, a silent acknowledgement that didn't go unnoticed. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Elias would assign Elara tasks, and she would perform them diligently, without complaint. She was stronger than she looked, and though she wasn't skilled in all the ranch chores, she was a quick learner. She chopped wood with a steady, determined swing, weeded the struggling vegetable patch with patient hands, and kept the small cabin surprisingly clean and orderly. Her cooking was simple but nourishing. She had a light touch with bread, and her stews, though made from meager ingredients, were flavorful. He found himself looking forward to meals, a small comfort in his otherwise stark existence. He began to observe her more closely. He noticed the way she would pause in her work to watch a hawk circle overhead, a wistful look on her face. He saw her speak softly to his old hound, Blue, who, to Elias's surprise, had taken to following her around like a shadow, thumping his tail whenever she was near. Blue was generally aloof with strangers. One afternoon, Elias returned from checking a far fence line to find Elara sitting on the cabin step, carefully mending one of his worn shirts. The stitches were tiny and neat, far better than his own clumsy attempts. She didn't look up as he approached, but he saw the slight blush on her cheeks. He merely grunted his thanks when she later handed it to him, but he felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. It was the care in the work, the unexpected act of quiet service. Alara, in turn, began to see beyond Elias's gruff exterior. She saw the weariness in his eyes at the end of a long day, the way his calloused hands were gentle when tending to an injured calf. She noticed the deep lines of sorrow etched around his mouth and eyes, hinting at a past pain he never spoke of. He was a man of few words, but his actions, she was beginning to learn, spoke volumes. He never raised his voice to her, never treated her with anything but a distant, respectful courtesy. He ensured she had enough to eat, that she had a safe place to sleep. In a world that had valued her at one degrading dollar, his quiet consideration was a balm to her wounded spirit. She began to feel a fragile tendril of security, something she hadn't felt since her parents died. One evening, as a storm gathered, they worked together to reinforce a loose section of the barn roof. The wind howled, and rain began to lash down. They were soaked through by the time they finished, but the roof held. Back in the cabin, shivering, they hung their wet clothes near the fire. Elias handed her a tin cup of hot coffee, their fingers brushing briefly. An unexpected jolt passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the shared effort, the small victory against the elements. For a moment, their eyes met, and he saw a flicker of something other than fear or gratitude in hers, perhaps a dawning trust. It was a fleeting moment, quickly broken, but it lingered in the air. This growing, unspoken understanding was soon tested. A nosy neighbor, Mrs. Crabtree, whose small holding bordered Elias's property to the east, rode over one afternoon, ostensibly to borrow some sugar, but clearly intent on inspecting Alara. She eyed Alara up and down, her expression sour. "So, this is the girl Thorne bought," she said to Elias, as if Alara wasn't even there. "Heard she weren't much to look at. They weren't wrong." Alara froze, her face paling. Elias stepped slightly in front of her. "Alara is a hard worker, Mrs. Crabtree, and a good woman. That's all that matters on this ranch." His tone was flat, final. Mrs. Crabtree sniffed, accepted the sugar with ill grace, and departed, leaving a trail of disapproval in her wake. Alara didn't speak for the rest of the day, retreating into herself. Elias felt a surge of protective anger, not just at Mrs. Crabtree, but at a world that could be so casually cruel. He found himself wanting to shield Alara from it, a feeling that was becoming increasingly familiar and unsettlingly strong. The man who had bought Ilara's sister, Clara, was named Silas Croft. He was a moderately wealthy merchant, known for his smug demeanor and his eye for a good deal, whether in goods or, apparently, people. They encountered him in Redemption Gulch during another supply run. Croft, preening beside his well-dressed wife, who was not Clara, caught sight of Elias and Alara. He sauntered over, a superior smirk on his face. "Thorne," he greeted, his gaze flicking dismissively over Alara. "Still got your bargain, I see." He paused, then added with false solicitude, "Clara is doing well, by the way. Settling in nicely at my brother's estate up north. A real lady's companion she is. Such a delicate flower, needed refined surroundings, you understand." The implication was clear. Clara, the beauty, was suited for better things, while Alara, the plain one, was fit only for Elias's rough ranch. Alara stiffened, but said nothing. Elias merely nodded curtly. "Glad to hear it, Croft." He turned to leave, but Croft wasn't finished. "You know, Thorne," he said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "if you ever find yourself overburdened, I might know a place for her. Scullery work, perhaps. Honest, if dull. The offer was an insult, thinly veiled. Elias's hand tightened on the reins of Buck. "She's not for sale, Croft, and she's no burden." His voice was dangerously quiet. He met Croft's eyes, and for a moment the merchant's smirk faltered. Elias led Ilara away, the encounter leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He was beginning to realize that his impulsive act of buying Ilara had drawn lines in the sand he hadn't anticipated. The incident with Croft cast a shadow. Ilara became even quieter, more withdrawn. Elias found himself watching her, a knot of worry tightening in his gut. He was growing accustomed to her presence, to the subtle ways she was changing the harsh fabric of his solitary life. The cabin felt warmer, cleaner. The meals were something to anticipate. Even Blue seemed happier. He found a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the windowsill one morning, its form surprisingly delicate. He knew Ilara must have whittled it. He said nothing, but left it where it was, a silent acknowledgement of her hidden talent. He found himself wanting to see her smile, a genuine smile, not the fleeting, hesitant curve of her lips he sometimes glimpsed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they sat on the small porch, a rare moment of shared stillness. Ilara was mending a tear in her dress, her head bent to her task. Elias was cleaning his rifle. The silence was comfortable, companionable. "It's beautiful," Ilara said softly, her gaze on the sunset. Elias looked up, surprised by her speaking first. "Aye," he agreed. "It is." He saw a softness in her face, a momentary peace that made her plain features seem different, less guarded. He realized with a jolt that he no longer saw her as the ugly sister. He saw Ilara, just Ilara, a woman of quiet strength, hidden depths, and a resilience that shamed him. His growing feelings for her, feelings he hadn't yet dared to name, made him clumsy. On their next trip to town, he found himself lingering by a display of ribbons in the mercantile. On an impulse, he bought a length of plain blue ribbon, the color of the evening sky after a storm. He presented it to her awkwardly back at the cabin, muttering something about it being for her hair. He expected her to be confused, perhaps even dismissive. Instead, a faint blush stained her cheeks. She took it wordlessly. The next morning, she had tied it in her brown hair. It was a small thing, but it felt significant, a silent message passing between them. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of Deacon Miller and Mrs. Henderson from the town's small church committee. They arrived unannounced, their expressions grimly pious. "Mr. Thorne," Deacon Miller began, his voice unctuous, "we've come on a matter of moral concern. Mrs. Larius, Mrs. Madius." Henderson nodded sharply, her eyes boring into Ilara, who stood frozen by the hearth. "It is not proper, Mr. Thorne," Mrs. Henderson declared, "for you to be housing this young woman without the sanction of marriage. It sets a bad example. Tongues are wagging." Elias felt a cold fury rise within him. "Ilara is here under my protection," he stated, his voice dangerously low. "She works hard for her keep. There is nothing improper occurring in this house." "Protection?" Deacon Miller raised an eyebrow. "Or exploitation? The girl was bought, Thorne, like chattel. Some say you're taking advantage of her unfortunate situation." Ilara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The word chattel hung in the air, ugly and demeaning. This was it, the turning point. Elias looked at Ilara, saw the raw pain in her eyes, the shame that threatened to consume her. And in that moment, something snapped within him. His carefully constructed walls of solitude, of emotional detachment, crumbled. He would not let them do this to her. He would not let them diminish her, or what was slowly, tentatively, growing between them. "Elara is not chattel," Elias said, his voice ringing with a conviction that startled even himself. He stepped forward, placing himself between Elara and their accusers. "She is a woman of worth and dignity, more than can be said for some who hide behind piety to spread their venom." Deacon Miller puffed up. "Are you questioning our motives, Thorne?" "I'm stating facts," Elias retorted. He turned to Elara, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "These people," he said, his voice loud enough for the deacon and Mrs. Sue Henderson to hear clearly, "they don't know you. They don't see your kindness, your strength, your spirit. But I do." He paused, then made the decision that would change everything. "And to silence their vicious tongues, and to give you the respect and security you deserve, I will offer you what little I have. Elara Vance, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The question hung in the air. Elara stared at him, her eyes wide with shock, then a dawning, incredulous hope. Deacon Miller and Mrs. Henderson were momentarily struck dumb. This was not the outcome they had anticipated. Elias kept his gaze on Elara, waiting. He saw the warring emotions on her face, fear, uncertainty, but also a flicker of something akin to gratitude, and perhaps something more. Silas Croft, it turned out, had been fanning the flames of gossip. Angered by Elias's earlier rejection of his offer for Elara, he'd taken to spreading malicious rumors, painting Elias as a lecherous recluse and Elara as his unwilling captive. The church committee's visit was a direct result of Croft's meddling. He wanted to discredit Elias, perhaps even force Elara into a situation where Croft could then rescue her, thereby asserting his own twisted sense of superiority. Elara looked from Elias's earnest, unexpectedly vulnerable face to the disapproving countenances of Deacon Miller and Mrs. Henderson. She thought of the auction, the humiliation, the casual cruelty. And then she thought of Elias, his quiet protection, his gruff kindness, the way he'd begun to look at her, as if he truly saw her, not just a burden or a bargain. She straightened her shoulders. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart hammered in her chest. "Yes, Mr. Thorne, I will." A slow smile, the first genuine smile Elias had ever seen from her, spread across her face. It transformed her. It lit her eyes, softened the lines of her face, and radiated a warmth that reached out and touched him. In that moment, Elias knew, with absolute certainty, that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Then we'll be married," Elias declared, turning back to the stunned church members, "as soon as the circuit judge passes through. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." He held the door open, his message clear. Deacon Miller and Mrs. Henderson, their mission thwarted and their authority challenged, retreated in disarray. The decision to marry, born of necessity and defiance, nevertheless brought a new dynamic to their relationship. There was an unspoken understanding, a shared purpose. Elias found himself talking more, sharing small details about the ranch, about his plans for the spring planting. Elara, in turn, offered her opinions, her insights surprisingly astute. They began to plan, not as master and servant, or protector and protected, but as partners. The shadow of the auction, of her perceived ugliness, began to recede, replaced by a growing respect and a deepening affection that neither of them dared to voice, but both keenly felt. The threat from Croft and the town's judgment still loomed, but now they would face it together. The circuit judge, Josiah Blackwood, was due in Redemption Gulch in a week. Elias and Elara decided they would ride in together, make their vows before him, and have their union legally recognized. It was their stand against the wagging tongues, their claim to a life of their own making. Ilara worked on mending her best dress, a simple calico, stitching with a new-found determination. Elias found himself watching her, the gentle curve of her neck as she bent over her sewing, the quiet grace of her movements. He was a man reborn, the ice around his heart slowly melting. The day they rode into town for the wedding was bright and clear, the sky an endless blue. Ilara wore the mended calico dress, the blue ribbon Elias had given her tied neatly in her hair. She held her head high, a quiet dignity about her that even the most hardened gossip couldn't entirely dismiss. Elias, in his cleanest shirt and brushed duster, rode beside her, his expression resolute. As they approached the small clapboard building that served as the town hall and occasional courthouse, they saw a small crowd gathered. Silas Croft was prominent among them, a sneer fixed on his face. Deacon Miller and Mrs. Henderson stood nearby, their expressions radiating disapproval. Judge Blackwood, a stern but fair man, was waiting inside. As Elias and Ilara entered, Croft called out from the doorway, "Come to legitimize your shame, Thorne. Marrying the ugly sister out of pity, are we? A fine match for a failed rancher." A few of Croft's cronies snickered. Ilara flinched, but Elias put a steadying hand on her arm. He turned to face Croft, his eyes blazing. "Croft," he said, his voice carrying clearly, "you wouldn't know beauty if it struck you blind. You see with eyes clouded by malice and ignorance." He drew Ilara slightly forward. "This woman, Ilara Vance, has more courage, more kindness, and more true worth in her little finger than you possess in your entire overfed body." He turned to the assembled onlookers, his voice ringing with passion. "You people look at her and see what you've been told to see, a plain face, a purchased girl. But I see a spirit that refuses to be broken. I see a heart capable of great loyalty and quiet strength. I see a woman who has brought light into a life that was dark for too long." He then looked directly at Ilara, his voice softening. "I didn't buy a servant or a laborer. I sought to offer shelter, and in return I found a partner, a companion, someone I admire more than words can say." Ilara's eyes filled with tears, but these were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of profound gratitude, of a heart overflowing. Emboldened by Elias's words, she found her own voice. She turned to Croft, her gaze direct and unwavering. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, "you bought my sister for her face. You judged me by mine. You see only surfaces. I pity you for your blindness. You can't comprehend a bond built on respect and shared hardship. Elias Thorne offered me safety when I had none. He has shown me kindness when the world showed me cruelty. And yes, I will marry him, not out of pity or duty, but because he is a good man, a man of honor. And because," she paused, then looked at Elias, her heart in her eyes, "he sees me." A hush fell over the room. Croft, for once, was speechless, his face mottled with anger and surprise. Even Deacon Miller and Mrs. Henderson looked discomfited. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat. "Well," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "it seems to me we have two people here who know their own minds and hearts. Shall we proceed?" The ceremony was brief, the words simple, but for Elias and Ilara, they sealed a bond forged in adversity and tempered by a love that had blossomed in the unlikeliest of circumstances. As they spoke their vows, looking only at each other, the hostile crowd, the judgmental town, faded into insignificance. There was only the truth of their connection, a truth more powerful than any prejudice. The ride back to the ranch was different from all the journeys that had come before. A quiet peace settled between them, a sense of battles faced and won, of a future finally, truly, their own. Back at the cabin, the familiar space felt transformed. It was no longer just his refuge or her shelter, it was their home. Elias awkwardly took Ilara's hand, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. She met his gaze, and this time, her smile was full, radiant, unreserved. It was the smile of a woman who knew she was loved, who knew her own worth. He leaned down and kissed her, a chaste, tender kiss that spoke of promises made and a lifetime to share. In the weeks and months that followed, a subtle shift occurred in Redemption Gulch. The story of Elias Thorne's passionate defense of Ilara and her own quiet, dignified response to Croft had spread. Some of the townsfolk, those capable of seeing beyond surface judgments, began to look at the couple with a new, grudging respect. Mrs. Henderson was seen offering Ilara a curt nod when they met in the mercantile. Deacon Miller avoided their gaze altogether. Silas Croft, his public humiliation still stinging, kept his distance. Ilara, no longer the auctioned girl or the ugly sister, blossomed. She moved with a newfound confidence, her quiet strength now infused with a gentle joy. Her laughter, once a rare and hesitant sound, became more frequent, echoing softly in the small cabin. Her herb garden flourished under her care, and she even started a small patch of wildflowers by the porch, bringing splashes of color to the rugged landscape. She was Elias's wife, his partner, an equal in every way. The ugliness that society had tried to impose on her was a distant memory, overshadowed by the inner beauty that Elias had seen from the start, a beauty that now shone from her like a gentle light. Elias watched her one evening as she sat by the fire, humming softly as she mended one of his shirts, the blue ribbon a cheerful spot of color in her brown hair. Her face, illuminated by the flickering flames, was calm and content. He thought of the auction, the desperation in her eyes, the casual cruelty of the crowd. He had gone there seeking mundane supplies, expecting nothing more than the continuation of his solitary life. Instead, he had found Ilara. He had paid a pittance for a life, a single dollar he could ill afford at the time, and in return, she had given him back his own heart, a heart he'd thought long dead. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was the richest man in the territory. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.